Hello, and welcome to the Feet on the Soil podcast, the podcast about the world beneath our feet and how we interact with it. For this episode, I don't have a specific topic, I don't have a guest. Instead, in front of me, I have a list of questions. I put up on my Instagram and my TikTok last week that I was looking for questions to do a little Q&A session. I've noticed, especially on my TikTok, I've been receiving a lot of questions about the environment and nature, and while I have been answering them through TikTok is very limiting, you know. You don't have much time to talk and you can't really delve into a topic as much, so I decided one of the best ways to get around this was to dedicate an episode of the podcast to answering a few of these questions. I'd like to start off by thanking everybody for submitting questions. I got some really good ones here, so we're going to spend a little bit of time on each question. And hopefully in the future I'll be able to do something like this again once I gather up enough questions. A few little updates just in general. Wanted to say a huge thank you to everybody. We've hit 2,000 followers on TikTok, which was actually the goal that I set myself for the full year of 2024. To have hit it before it even reached autumn, I was really excited. I posted a video with an audio I'd made of a Peter O'Toole interview over a song I quite like, and the response was amazing. Started with a few nice comments about people talking about their love of Ireland and snowballed a little bit into an audio which now has, I think, over 500 uses. Just the other day I saw that RTE used it to show the winners of the Olympics, the Irish winners, which I thought was pretty amazing, that RTE have used a sound that I made. So big thank you to everybody who's been kind of interacting with that, and thank you to everybody who's followed me on TikTok. I also wanted to just say thank you in general, just to the response of the podcast so far. I've had some fantastic guests on, and a lot of people have reached out just to talk to me about the podcast, whether that's in person or over social media. And it's been, pretty much all positive, which it's just really nice. This is something that I've been very passionate about. I've always wanted to be a little bit more outspoken about my love of nature. I just didn't think that anybody would really respond to it. So to see people reaching out and talking about how this has improved their enjoyment of nature has been really fantastic. I'm also going to be doing my first, I suppose, podcast on the other side. I won't announce exactly who it is, but I think this coming Sunday, it'll be a bit of a surprise when you see my name popping up beside the host of this other podcast. But I really enjoyed recording it, and I'll be kind of featuring it on all my social medias, so keep your eye out on Sunday for a special Feet on the Soil appearance. And with those little thank yous out the way, I got a few questions, but one of them really stood out as a really piercing question. This is an example of, I think, almost investigative journalism into Feet on the Soil. And it's a question that came from, friend of the podcast, Adam. He was the first guest of the podcast. And with this question, I think he really gets to the root of everything that Feet on the Soil stands for. And it's a real challenge to answer this question. So the question was as follows: favourite duck? Now, when I first read this, the mind boggled, I didn't know how to answer, what to answer, who to answer, why to answer, really. But had a quick look through a bird spotting book. And I mean, I just did this to re-jog the memory. One hopped out at me immediately. I could have gone for the classic mallard, the everyman's duck. Every pond or stream in the country probably has a little mallard at the side of it. But I thought, no, this is too basic of an answer. I have to really express myself through this choice of favourite duck. And then all of a sudden it was just so clear to me. My favourite has to be the little grebe. While it's of course adorable, they're a very, very small bird, and just something about them looks like how you would draw a cartoon duck. They're almost like a real life rubber duck. The reason I chose this duck was, of course, its cuteness, but also there's a pond where I work, and over the past few months we've kind of been watching the development of first the little grebes creating a nest, just nestled in amongst some reeds, and a bit mishmash, but eventually they started to really get a nice little place going for themselves. And one day I was not in work, but I received a text, and it was just pure excitement because the little grebes had laid some little grebe eggs in the nest. This was obviously fantastic. So we followed this journey of these little grebes for the next few weeks, and eventually one day we went down, and the nest was empty, and there was a little grebe duckling swimming around in the pond. I just thought it was a lovely time, I guess, It coincided with me starting to really, really gain more of an interest in documenting nature and talking about it. And I don't know, it was just a nice time. So in answer to your question, Adam, my favourite duck is a little grebe. The next question came from someone who's been following the Feet on the Soil account for a while, and thank you for that. The question is, what do you think of how modern farming interacts with nature? This is, of course, a really difficult question, especially in a country like Ireland. A huge amount of our emissions come from agriculture, and there's no way of escaping that. Of course, agriculture is also a huge part of Irish culture, heritage, economy, so it's naturally going to be a large part of our emissions. A country that has a huge amount of industry is obviously going to accredit most of its emissions to industrial uses, just because that is what they produce. Over the years, my views have kind of flip-flopped. For a while, I was very much against farming. I would see all these statistics of most of the land use that we have to grow vegetables is then used to feed animals when it could just be used to feed humans. And while I'm still, slightly in agreement with this, I think that farming can be a net positive for nature. During my time studying horticulture, I did my work experience with a small-scale farmer, and in that time found more appreciation for nature than I ever had before. The farmer clearly cared for the land that he inhabited. This wasn't just something for profit, it was a way for him to care for land. So this sort of small-scale farming where the person is conscious of the reasons why biodiversity are important. They're conscious of how the way that they're treating their animals and in turn treating their land is going to result in net positives for them, both in the longevity of their land, but also commercially. This can usually be an improvement. I've also spent nearly the last 2 years now working on what is essentially an urban farm. This farm practices a lot of sustainable agriculture, so regenerative farming, certified organic vegetables, using specialist breed animals to help preserve these breeds. And through this, I've also had conversations with farmers, whether that be the farmers on site or people from off site who have come in to either see the farm or speak with us or any number of things. And through these experiences, I've really learned that farmers are, in a way, very much villainized by a lot of environmentalists. I'm not saying that they're perfect, and I'm not saying that there's farmers out there who aren't negatively impacting water quality or land quality or even air quality, but I do think that modern farming is going in a certain negative direction, whereas in the past it was a net positive for the environment. We're seeing more and more groups, people like Farming for Nature, who are really pushing forward this message that farming can be a positive. I really recommend that if you're not already, have a follow of the Farming for Nature podcast. Hear out these farmers and how they're improving the land. And for the most part, a lot of people who listen to my podcast are from urban areas of Ireland. And of course, I am guilty of this as well. We're from urban areas and we do care about the environment, but we don't interact with it nearly as much as we should. Farmers who are out there every day interacting with nature will usually have a little bit more appreciation for the general stuff, They'll know when wildflowers are coming up. They'll be able to tell how well a year is going weather-wise by the time that buds come out on the trees. And usually they'll have that sort of almost folkloric connection to the land. On the opposite side, of course, there is industrial farming that happens in Ireland and around the world. And Ireland, it's a very privileged place. I know that you see these huge stands of trees cut down in the Amazon or in Southeast Asia in order to make way for either palm plantations or soy or rice or any number of things. And so Ireland really isn't the kind of epicenter of negative farming. But what I do think it can do is serve as a little bit of a template. We have a lot of farmers out there that are already practicing really fantastic sustainable management methods. And if we can promote this, I believe that we can prove that modern farming interacts with nature in a positive way. The next question kind of leads on from what I was saying about kind of the urban environment and how that impacts our interaction with nature. And this is from another very involved viewer of the Feet on the Soil ecosystem, I guess. So again, thank you so much for that. The question is, why is there so little conservation interest or interest in nature in the average Irish person? I've talked about this in the past, and in fact, I think like the first 4 or 5 episodes of this podcast really revolved around nature connection. I'm going to start by talking about conservation interests, and then I'll talk about interest in nature in general. But with conservation interest, I think the real fact of the matter is, while a lot of people are aware that climate change is a thing, I think that a big reason why conservation interest is very low in Ireland is just because we don't even realise that we have to conserve things. We have this image of the Emerald Isle, this kind of oasis of nature on the coast of Europe, but really our nature is really doing quite badly. I've talked at no end about our really, really dire situation in terms of forestry. 11% coverage is among the lowest in Europe, 1% of that being native forestry. That is a really genuinely scary fact. Most people who listen to this podcast have probably already heard of Owen Dalton. He wrote a book, The Irish Atlantic Rainforest, and has a beautiful area out in the Beara Peninsula where he is bringing back that Atlantic rainforest. Following his Instagram account has, I suppose it's opened my eyes a lot to something I already knew. Even the areas of really good examples of ancient forestry in Ireland are hugely damaged. They're not, the postcard perfect template for what we should be aiming for. They hold most of the elements of what we need, but they're still being overgrazed by deer or in danger from Sitka spruce plantations. And I mean, that's just on the forestry side. As far as insects, I don't know if it's just me, but I have not seen half the amount of insects I usually do this year. Butterflies and dragonflies seem especially low, but one thing that leaped out to me was I was scrolling through LinkedIn and an ecologist that I followed said that they had seen next to no wasps this year. And while a lot of people wouldn't be the biggest fan of wasps, they're that insect that you can identify from the second you're born nearly. We know flies, we know beetles, we know wasps, we know bees. And really our insect levels are dropping and dropping and dropping. I believe the figure is that insect levels in the UK have dropped by 40% in the last 40 years, and I would imagine that the Irish population isn't doing too much better. With birds, we see the same case. So many of our birds are now red listed, and just a mix of all these things show that conservation in Ireland is desperately, desperately needed. But we've marketed ourselves as this wild place. We have the heritage and history of wilderness. We were one of the only places in Europe to not be conquered by the Roman Empire. So even back then we were seen as this last outpost of wilderness. And we've really clung on to that to the point where you talk to a lot of Irish people these days and they believe that we are an example of what the rest of the world can be when it comes to nature. And honestly, it really couldn't be further from the truth. I'm not saying that we should abandon all hope, but I do think that this is the reason for the very little conservation interest that we have. Lately, this has definitely been improving through people like Owen Dalton, who are promoting that we aren't what we say we are. We're not this perfect outpost of nature. We are in dire, dire need of conservation interest and conservation action. Other groups like Rewild Wicklow, who I see constantly doing proper work to try and restore peatlands or forestry around the Wicklow area. This is really furthering that knowledge. Without the knowledge of the need for conservation, there isn't going to be any conservation interest. I mean, you even see, mainstream media, RTE and stuff like that, talking about how much this is needed. And that's something that's relatively new. So I really do hope that the more people start talking about this stuff, the more conservation interest we get. On the other side of that question, general interest in nature. I think this is a very kind of urban-centric problem, of course. I mean, Dublin, Galway, Cork, Limerick, these are areas that are developing incredibly quickly and our reliance on nature is lessening by the day. A lot of people will now associate getting out into nature with getting out into a local park. A park, while there is nature there, of course, it's not the same as a real intimate experience with nature. I had this conversation with Nullig on our episode, but something like wild camping where you're relying on your knowledge of nature and you're relying on nature to kind of hold your hand almost. This is the type of thing that really, I think, builds an interest. It shows you that nature isn't just this background scenery that's kind of an escape for you at the end of a week of work. It's something that's absolutely integral to our lives. I'm currently reading a fantastic book called Nature by Ralph Waldo Emerson. And throughout, I mean, this book was written in, I believe, the mid-1800s, but the lessons are just so weirdly relevant. It's incredible to think that even at this time when wilderness was quite a lot healthier, there was still a disconnect. So he's talking in this book about how a connection to nature can improve human health, which is something that really we're only coming to terms with now. I mean, there's a beautiful extract from this book I'm just going to read out really quickly. My head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or parcel of God. The name of the nearest friend sounds then foreign and accidental. To be brothers, to be acquaintances, master or servant, is then a trifle and a disturbance. I am the lover of uncontained and immortal beauty. In the wilderness, I find something more dear and connate than in streets or villages. I think that's absolutely beautiful. I think it's showing that while we can find beautiful experiences in cities and in towns, we can have these amazing social experiences or huge festivities or huge kind of anthropocentric enjoyment. Nature is what we truly are, and so we really need that connection. Interest has diminished in nature just because we feel that the town is what gives us life. To be surrounded by people and noise and excitement, that's real life. But nature can give us so much more than that. I think in Ireland specifically, we've almost been shamed away from an enjoyment of nature. We were the agricultural paddies, we were backwards, and this kind of Celtic tiger idea of becoming more and more European, becoming more and more civilized, has shamed us away from this innate connection to nature that we have. I think this is the same for nearly every country at the moment, but this is just me speaking from an Irish context. In recent years, definitely the same as with the conservation interest, more and more people have gained an interest in nature, me included. I find that to be fascinating. I think as we really reach the climax of our reliance on technology, when every single person has a phone in their pocket which does things that even 40 years ago couldn't have even been imagined from a supercomputer, as AI becomes something that's really, really either exciting or terrifying depending on who you ask. The fact that so many people are turning back to nature, I think really speaks to something. I think I've answered that question. That was a bit of a rambly one, but that's kind of what this is for. The next question, a really great question here. What are the most significant ways in which biodiversity impacts human well-being? This is very relevant to the last two guests that we've had on, both John Gibbard and Dr. Camilla. Dr. Camilla and myself had a fantastic conversation, both while recording and after, about how biodiversity is essential to human well-being. In forest bathing, you really need that biodiversity. You have to have that diversity of sound, smell, touch, sight, and you don't get that in most areas. Like I said, a park is nice, but it's ornamental. It's being created to emulate nature. When you're out in real, true biodiversity in one of these ancient woodlands or semi-native broadleaf woodlands, you get something different to what you would get in a park or along one of the marked kind of trails that go through one of the many Sitka spruce plantations by Quilcha. And I think any exposure to nature is positive. I don't want you to think that getting out into a park or something like that is a bad thing. It definitely isn't, and you are still getting most of those benefits of being out in nature. But the main thing that me and Camilla were talking about is just how getting into a true biodiverse area, an area like the Vale of Clara where we were, or even something like Massey Woods in South Dublin, these are places where we can really get a glimpse at what we could have. On a more kind of practical level, I mean, biodiversity is essential, you know. I mean, there's always that thing thrown around where if every human disappeared tomorrow, the world would kind of find ease in itself quite quickly. But if every insect, then we'd be done. Biodiversity is what creates our food systems. It's what creates our microclimates. It's what creates the air that we breathe. It's essential to everything that we do. And I mean, you know, lately I've found a huge fascination in bats. And while for a long time I would have been one of these people who was scared that they would get stuck in my hair and I thought that they were flying mice, the more I learn about them, the more it feeds my knowledge of biodiversity. Bats in the United States save farmers $10 billion every year just by the amount of pests that they eat. But these bats can only survive as long as there are pests to eat. So not only are they saving costs on pesticides, but by the fact that they're reducing pesticides, they're increasing insect populations. And this isn't always a negative thing. An increase in insects means an increase in food for different birds, for different ground-living mammals like badgers or hedgehogs. And all in, it just creates this food web. And it's something that not only do we need for for human well-being in terms of our mental health and how good we feel about the environment, it's something that we need for every element of our living. I think projects like, wildflower beds and small wildlife ponds are great. On a local level, they create higher levels of biodiversity, but really what's needed is wide-scale awareness of biodiversity, but more so action. We're seeing more and more projects in the national parks where we're creating new national parks or improving older ones, but honestly, a lot of the action feels like it's just coming a little bit too slow. We are, without a doubt, in a biodiversity crisis, and the actions that are being taken just seem a little bit lackluster. One final note on biodiversity for human well-being is something that I've really began to value through the kind of interviews with Monk and Magan that I've been listening to, or even his fantastic TikToks that he produces, where we see that landscape and nature hold stories. So human well-being, of course, is physical and it's mental, but it's also spiritual and cultural. We value the stories that we learn when we're children. We value the stories about our local area that may not be 100% true, but a lot of these things are held together by biodiversity. The area that I'm from, Glenasmole, owes a lot to the River Dodder, something that I'll be exploring in a very near episode. This is an element of biodiversity, the riverway, and so many stories are kind of contained in that river. Same with forestry, same with natural elements like, rock formations, natural rock formations, things like the Giant's Causeway. And I'm not saying that the Giant's Causeway or a river in general are created by biodiversity, but it's an example of how natural things, much like wildlife, hold stories and as a result allow us to connect with something that is kind of beyond ourselves. And I think this is a big, big reason why we're seeing a little bit more interest in nature. As I was talking about in the last question, people want to connect back to these stories. They want to connect back to the lands that surround them. And if the landscape isn't there anymore, I worry that the stories will fade as well. The final question now, and it's a bit of a broad one, but this one is, what are some actions an individual can take in regards to nature? So like I said, just on that last question, there are real kind of physical actions that you can take that have an impact more so on a local level. Something like the stepping stone forest that we talked about in the last episode. These are going to make a really noticeable difference in your local area. Of course, talking to John, we were hearing about increased bird life, increased mammal life. The increase in native trees is also going to improve water quality, air quality. I mean, this is a fantastic thing. Something like not necessarily planting wildflowers, but leaving something like a hare's corner, a corner of the garden which you just allow to grow wild. Whatever seeds are already in that seed bank, allow them to come up. As little maintenance as possible, and insects, small mammals, birds are going to love this sort of thing. The other thing I've been getting more and more into is wildlife ponds. It was something I really got into after listening to an episode of the Blind Boy podcast featuring Collie Ennis. He talked about how he had nearly turned his back garden in Tala into a swamp just through the amount of wildlife ponds. And that got me really interested. And like I said, there's a variety of ponds in the place I work. And I just started, I suppose, valuing them more. I was seeing the beautiful Dubenton's bats out over them at night time. I was seeing dragonflies in the day, small birds like little grebes, mallard ducks, herons and water chickens, as I call them, but also the riparian species, things like alder, willow. All of these things started leaping out to me a lot more. And of course, talking to someone like Rob, who we had on a previous episode, he was talking more about ocean life, but I just started to value water a lot more. So I think a wildlife pond is something fantastic. There's a lot of resources online about how you can create your own and the best way to do so. This is something that can be done even in a barrel. If you have an apartment with a balcony that you don't use too much, a basin filled with water or a barrel is still going to give habitat to water nesting insects. Or if you're on the low floors, even something like frogs or newts can make space in these. But I think at the moment, the place that we're at right now it's quite bad in terms of nature. An individual can make a lot of difference, but I think one of the big things, again, is something we discussed with John, and that's really getting involved with a community, really getting involved with organisations. Stuff like Home Tree, Rewild, Wicklow, even Stepping Stone Forests, these are groups which can make a far larger difference than just one individual. And now is a time when it's really about policy. We've seen the nature restoration laws come into effect, and I mean, a lot of that was due to community groups. The more that we can get people together into organised groups, the better. So have a look online, whether it's your local river that you value protecting, a local forest you wish to rewild a certain area of your locality. There's more than likely already a group of people out there who share similar values to yourself. Get yourself out there, and by speaking with these people, you're going to learn more about what you can do as an individual as well. Like I said, I only learned about things like pocket forests, stepping stone forests, wildlife ponds, natural wildflower meadows, all of these things I just learned through speaking to people. These weren't things that I read in books or anything like that. I've learned about them more through books since and researching them, but the original sort of spark of that idea came from speaking to people. So I can't recommend enough, get involved with community actions. And on that note, that's all my questions for this week. I really liked kind of interacting in this way and getting questions that people are asking. I find sometimes I can get a little bit lost in the details, and while I find it very interesting to talk about a certain topic, it might be, away from other people. I'd love to do more kind of question and answer episodes like this in the future, so keep an eye out. I'll probably post something on my Instagram story or on my TikTok asking for questions, and if you have anything, you can always DM me and I'll either get back to you directly or create an episode like this in the future. We'll be back to regular episodes next week, and I plan on expanding my kind of mini-series on Glenna Small with an episode about the Dodder. I'm really excited for this one. I've been doing a lot of research into it, and it will kind of coincide with the release of a film, This Is Your River. So I'm really excited to talk about that. We're also lining up a few more guests lately, and we've got some really, really exciting ones. But instead of waiting for them, if you haven't listened to some of our other episodes, definitely go back and have a listen through. We've had some fantastic conversations so far. If you're enjoying the podcast, you can always share it with friends, share it online, or review it on whatever platform you're listening on. Thank you so much to everybody who's listened so far and who's made it through this episode. And try and get outside today.